Welcome back. We are continuing with our exploration of simplified, standardized Yang 88 Taijiquan. Last piece that we did was on the first half of Grasp Sparrow's tail, which is a move that breaks down into 4 pieces. That is ward off, roll back, press, and push. Last time we did ward off and roll back, and we introduced the idea of the 13 postures or 13 concepts of 13 principles of Taiji. So we will be continuing where we left off and following through from roll back into press and into push. So in this video, we will be looking at not just the external pieces of these 2 movements, such as where our hands are going, but also the internal components in terms of what we should be feeling and what we should be expressing internally as well as externally in these moves and postures. So let's first look at what the move is doing on the floor. So we finish roll back and we begin press. As we press, we want to turn in the hips. Left hand comes up, right hand also comes up slightly, and as we complete our turn, this begins our press here between the hands and complete the press completely, finish by coming forward. At this point, our left hand is applying pressure forward, our right hand is applying pressure really just by staying still but slightly backward towards us. That is our press between our hands. Then we begin push. Hands wipe off as we settle the hips, shift back, roll the hands backward, drop the pelvis, hands and palms drop into place, shift the weight forward, and finish our push by pushing our hands forward. In both the roll back and the preparation for push, be mindful not to shift too far back onto the back foot. We do want to come backwards, but we don't want to come too far backwards. Some people recommend pulling the front foot up by the toes. Personally, I don't think that's a good idea, but we'll get into that as we break the move down. Good. All right. So, as before, we went into the external components and then the internal components of each form, of each piece. So the first movement here is press. Whenever we have press in our form, it will be expressed externally in the idea, in the motion of 2 hands coming towards each other in opposition. Internally, it's a bit more than that, but externally, it's always going to be 2 hands coming together in opposition. So in the case of Yang form here, we've finished coming out of roll back, come around, and now press is this here. This hand is coming towards us, this hand is coming away from us. We also want to remember that this press is settling through the back leg and then pushing forward into the front leg, which changes how we're loading, how the tension is loading through the front arm and through the back arm. There is a concept in Taiji, or more like a useful hint, opposite relationship of fullness with regards to hands and feet. So in other words, what that means is when we have one foot that is full, that means the other hand is full. And when the opposite, when one leg is empty, that means the other hand is empty. But this really relates to sort of stasis versus action. In other words, when one leg is full, the opposite hand is full. That fullness is sort of a structure, a stasis, a point of reference almost that you'll be now coordinating movement around. And when whatever leg is empty, the opposite hand is now going to be a more active hand, a hand that is coordinating action around the sort of stasis hand. In the case of how this applies to press is when we are on our back leg is full. Our back leg is, in a certain sense, static is not really the right word for this because it's not doing nothing, but it's kind of, which means that our front hand is just coming up into position. And our back hand, correlating to our front foot, our back hand is now coming around and applying the press here as we sink into the hip. But then as we shift our weight forward, those roles reverse. Because now, as we shift our weight forward, the back hand becomes our static hand, and our front hand becomes our active pressing hand, this way. That's why we want to think of both hands coming together, but on one side it's more on this side, and as we shift forward, that transfers over into this hand being the press, pulling towards us. Kind of interesting thing to play around with. Take that idea and also put it into your other movements in the form, or your other styles, if you do other styles, like Chen, for instance, and you'll find that the moves unlock a lot of new and interesting ideas for applications that you may not have considered before, or the applications you already know will become easier to do as a result. Now that covers mainly the external side of things. So the internal side of things, we touched on that a little bit with this sort of empty, full, static action dichotomy. Poor words, I'll have to come up with better vocabulary for that. But internally, press is, just like with ward off, just like with rollback, press refers to one of the four main Taiji principles. And in this case, it's not just the hands coming towards each other in opposition. It is actually considered the entire body split in half, compressing itself in opposition. And what this is for is to apply pressure, apply compression, sometimes to your own body in order to release it in the form of Fajing, sometimes, usually, in most cases, especially in Simplified Yang, where there really isn't any expression of Fajing, you will be doing this compression against somebody else, or putting somebody else's body under this compression using your hands. So we can see other examples of press in the form, not just in this obvious movement for which it is named. You can consider a fist at elbows bottom, compression, right? You can consider, to some extent even, you can consider repulse monkey, compression, right? That's the weaker example, but you'll find other examples in the Yang simplified form all over the place. So when we're thinking of this compression, like I said, we want to think of splitting the body in half and then using those two halves to move in a coordinated sense against each other such that compression is being applied to an external body. Now, when we do the form, we don't have an external body to apply this to. But when you have a partner to work with, you can play around with that in the form of pushing hands. We'll get there. Dividing the body in half can be considered in many different ways. Vertically, horizontally. Usually when we consider it horizontally, as mentioned earlier, we are dealing with opposite leg and foot, opposite hand and foot correlation, opposite leg and arm correlation, that type of thing. So right side of chest, but left leg or vice versa. Not always. Sometimes we're thinking just purely left side of body and right side of body, and those will coordinate in a certain way. Taiji, in principle, is very much about symmetries and a complementary motion taking place on the left as well as the right, even if it's not obvious. It's usually going to be, that kind of motion is usually going to be internal, with the external expression of that motion being almost incidental once you get into proper Taiji training. So in the case of press, we have, obviously the two hands are coordinating into this compression motion up here, with the legs also doing the same, compressing to bring them together and then pushing, coming forward. This compression in the hands, you can see, is mirrored. It's actually coming from the core. It's the two shoulders dropping into place, the hips also coordinating to drop and press into place. So the whole body is acting out this press. It's not just bring my hands up and then bang them together just from the arms. It's the whole body enacting that press in order to create that compression. So after we've completed our press, then we do our push. Our push externally, as you saw, is not a whole lot going on there. You just want to make sure that we are moving from our core and not our sternum when we are pulling back out of here. So we'll be wiping our hands off and then pulling from the core, settling into our back leg, dropping. This drop prompts our wrists to drop. It's the same drop. It's not 1 and 2 coordinated. It's the same drop. This drops and the wrists also drop. And then as we finish the drop, we shift forward and come forward. Some people like to really emphasize, as I mentioned before, really emphasize 1 and then 2, 1 and 2, in order to get you to think about that curve at the end. I recommend making that curve as small and as tight as you possibly can, but only as much as you possibly can. So in the beginning, that curve probably will be relatively big. But remember, this curve, what the hands are doing, is incidental to what is happening internally. So when you're doing this move, you should get this feeling of drop, and then we finished our drop, so now we can start to shift forward. Think of our force when we are applying force, or receiving force too. When we're dealing with force, we want to make sure that our force is like a bus. And what I mean by that is it takes a lot of energy for a bus to stop moving and then begin moving in the opposite direction. And much less force, much less energy for a bus to perhaps be at Talladega and just be going around in a corner. As you get better at manipulating force, manipulating tension, manipulating energy, I guess, but we'll just stick with force and tension, then your awareness of this force is going to be less like a bus and more like a precision-tuned Italian supercar. But you're still going to have to rotate around these small, tight corners with very, very demanding handling. So when we're doing this in the form, all the moves have this, by the way, but the push is a good example because we come back and then drop and come forward. This drop is that manipulation of that corner, that turn. We don't want to come back and then shift, come back and then switch directions and come forward again. We want to have a continuous, uninterrupted flow of motion. One last piece for push we want to think of internally. Remember, we want to start from our core and then express this push outwards, but also down into our legs. Both legs at the same time, by the way. Again, Taiji considers the whole body at once. We don't want to think too much of just one part of the body at a time. We want to think of pushing our awareness into all 4 of our limbs, all up and down our spine, through our core, all more or less simultaneously. So when we're doing our push, we're thinking of pulling back at first. This rotation too, by the way, is part of the hips rotating around. As we pull back, we're pulling in through our hands as well as pulling into the soles of our feet. So we come back and drop. And then when we press forward, we are now pushing not just through our back leg, but through our front leg as well. Because when we push through our front leg, that will prompt us to turn the hips just enough if we need to, and it will also prompt us to stop moving forward once we're far enough. Because if we move too far forward, we can no longer push through that front leg. We finish pushing not just through our legs, but also through here, expressing that push forward. Not really pushing like we're pushing an appliance or a car, just expressing that expansion, as we've talked about in the last video with Wardoff, except this expansion is now much more tuned to be in specific directions and not just expanding through the whole frame like a balloon. All right, that pretty much brings us to the end of Grass Sparrow's tail of Penglu Jian, ward off, roll back, press, and push. As mentioned in the last piece, especially for the top 4 of the 13 postures or 13 principles, remember that these are expressed in pretty much every move of the form. The external elements may not be, but what they're really trying to get at, the expansion, contraction, the compression, the motion away from each other, that is going to be in every move of the form. Hope you have enjoyed. Hope this has contributed to some understanding of Taiji or martial theory. If you have never done Taiji before, then I encourage you to find an instructor. These are no substitute for in-person instruction. They're more of an addition or an augmentation to. If you already have an instructor and some of what I'm saying is familiar, great. If it's not familiar, well, I hope that you get something out of it. As always, thank you for listening, and we will see you hopefully next time.